flew on early TWA constellations back in 1948 when I was 2 years old. And almost, you can believe that, and almost 20 years later, I was a passenger on one of the last TWA constellation flights. And during my law practice, I traveled all over the country to Hawaii and to the UK on TWA for business. And my wife and I flew TWA domestically and internationally on vacations. Our last TWA flight was in the fall of 2001, shortly before it ceased to exist, when the agent upgraded us to first class as a gesture of appreciation for our business. So the subject really came naturally. Excuse me while I flip my nose. I don't have a nice PowerPoint presentation. I just have 8.5 by 11 paper. So how did Daniel and I come together to tell this story? Well, back in 2011, my wife came home from the Kirkwood Library from a book she thought that I might find interesting. It was called Flying Across America, the Airline Passenger Experience. And it featured first-hand accounts of riding the airlines from the 1920s to the 1970s. She was right, it was interesting. Now look, the author was this guy named Daniel L. Rust, and the jacket liner said he was a professor at UMSL. So I thought, well, I need to reach out to this person. And I learned that he was about to give a presentation on the subject of airline history to an OASIS meeting in Clayton. So I went to the OASIS meeting, listened to the presentation, and introduced myself to Daniel at the end. It was the start of a long friendship and collaboration. So we first embarked on a history project about Lambert Airport and its many connections to aviation history and to American history. While we were researching at the History Museum, they asked us if we'd be interested in writing up a history for publication. We said, yes, of course. So we worked with Lauren Mitchell and her staff, and the book was published in November 2016, called The Aerial Crossroads of America, St. Louis's Lambert Airport. Well, writing the Lambert book involved a lot of TWA history. St. Louis had been an important part of the TWA network and its predecessor, transcontinental air transport, going back to 1929. After the book was published, Daniel and I decided to undertake a history of TWA. It was kind of a natural transition, emphasizing its connections to St. Louis and Kansas City, and the larger than life characters who made it and ultimately destroyed it. So I started researching and writing while I was still at the law firm, supposedly still doing billable work. After I retired at the end of 2017, I began interviewing former TWA employees, and many of them had worked for Ozark Airlines before the merger. And several of them said, Alan, you're our last chance to get the Ozark story told. Now, I thought that story deserved to be told. So for about a year, I stepped back from TWA and wrote a book called Up There with the Biggest, The Story of Ozark Airlines. Daniel reviewed it, commented on it, and revised the draft manuscript, and he helped me get it published. So then, back to TWA, Daniel was instrumental in getting us access to the TWA archives and corporate records in the Mercantile Library housed at UMSL. They encompass the entire 75-year history of TWA and its predecessors. And those documents and corporate minute books literally took us inside the rooms where the decisions were made that led to the rise and fall of the airline. We were also very fortunate to be able to interview a number of key TWA leaders, including Bill Compton and Jerry Gittner, the last CEO and chairman. We were unsuccessful, however, in getting Carl Icahn to talk with us. In March of 2022, we thought it was time to look for a publisher. Because of the nice relationship we had with the History Museum, we pitched it to them, and they accepted. We worked closely with Lauren Mitchell, with Christy Lean and their colleagues, putting the narrative into final form and collecting the imagery. So all of that brought us to where we are today and tonight. And now that it's a reality, Daniel and I hope that you will enjoy the book as much as we enjoyed writing it. So, without further ado, I give you my friend, colleague, and co-author, Professor Daniel Rust.
Well, good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Alan, for the introduction. And it's been an absolute delight to collaborate with Alan Hoffman and be friends and to work together on these great projects over the years. Great to have all of you here tonight. Thank you for being here and talk briefly about the book. I'm going to hit on some highlights, more of the themes. Don't want to give away all the good stuff out of the book, but to kind of put your appetite a little bit, and especially those of you who maybe aren't familiar with TWA. I teach all modes of transportation in my program, and I asked students, I did just a couple weeks ago, said, do you know Transworld Airlines? I met with all these blank stares. And I realized that the oldest person in the room was born after 9/11. Okay, so audience here tonight, you understand TWA a lot more than my students, so it's very good. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. So yes, the three characters that we zero in on in this book: Charles Lindbergh, Howard Hughes, and Carl Icahn. Three that were, as we say, larger than life. Three that many times would exert more influence and power than even those who are the corporate leaders. And I'll briefly run through some of that history and so you get the context of this. Start with Charles Lindbergh. We're here in St. Louis. Have a replica of the Spirit of St. Louis hanging over the room where we had a little bite to eat tonight. And being in St. Louis, probably familiar with the name Charles Lindbergh. He was originally from Minnesota, and his father was a congressman from Minnesota, and he got the idea of wanting to fly. And he came to St. Louis in 1923, the air races, and realized he wanted to really make this his career, his passion with the military, learned to fly the Army way, and then came back to St. Louis and was with the Robertson brothers, and he flew the very earliest flight of any American Airlines predecessor. It's April 15, 1926, was a flight between Chicago and St. Louis by Charles Lindbergh. Now, one of those flights, as an airmail pilot, they got the idea, why shouldn't I be the one to go for the Ortique Prize, to win the money to fly from New York to Paris? He gets some backers together from St. Louis, has the airplane built, names of the Spirit of St. Louis, and in May 1927, he does, many thought was impossible, single-engine airplane, one pilot, flying across the Atlantic Ocean. Became world famous, really the first modern celebrity. And here's the picture here, actually in our archives here at the History Museum, and that's his handwriting saying thank you to Albert von Lambert for his support. Lambert was the first to get $1,000 for the project, and that's Lambert's handwriting at the top there on this print. And when I got to hold that in the archives, it's a special moment to have that connection with him. Well, he does this flight in 27, he comes back stateside, he is the greatest celebrity in the world, but he wants to use his celebrity for something more purposeful. And he has this idea to have an airline to fly coast to coast, but it's not just an airline, it's rail at night, airplanes in the daytime. But it really wasn't safe enough, he wouldn't trust night flying. And he gets different backers. His backers from St. Louis pitch in. They like the idea. Clement Keyes, who's a big financier from Wall Street. The Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the largest corporations at the time. Their president thought it was a wonderful idea. And so they pitch in, and it becomes a very well-funded venture. July 1929, this starts out. And you can see on the route there, what's in blue is what's the railroads at night, and then what's in yellow is during the day. St. Louis was a key stop for them, And the picture there on the right is Charles Lindbergh himself making the first flight from Los Angeles heading eastbound. And he was hired as a member of the team. In fact, he is their TAT Technical Committee chair, which means he actually selected the airplanes. He told Ford how many seats put in the airplane, the specifications he wanted. He hired the pilots. He told them where to put the airports. He was the person. What he said went. And as far as forming TWA, a lot is owed to Charles Lindbergh for setting up this airline, the Transcontinental Air Transport. Makes really good money, 1929, $10,000 a year, $200,000 in stock. The airline calls it the Lindbergh line. So they are going to leverage their association with Charles Lindbergh to the maximum. Well, TAT never really made money. It struggled and had a new postmaster general comes into power after Hoover was elected. And this person, Walter Folger Brown, has an idea that there's all these little airlines and they're all competing. It's just a mix match. He says, I want to have a more rational system of 4 big airlines. And he sets out to make that happen using his power as the postmaster general. He calls them together, the executive says, okay, here's the deal. I want to have 1 airline fly across the southern United States. It becomes American Airlines. So I want 1 across the north. It becomes United Airlines. I want 1 airline on the East Coast, Eastern Airlines. And then he said, I want 1 across the middle of the country. And TAT, you've had this service, which is pretty good, but you don't fly all the way. You have a rail service. And so to make this happen, flying coast to coast, you have to merge with Western Air Express in California that has experience, has airplanes, and then this upstart, Pennsylvania Aviation Industries Corporation, was flying across Pennsylvania to New York. And so he said, you 3 have to get together, and called a shotgun marriage. They didn't want to. Like, we resist this. But he said, you want airmail contracts? This is the deal. So they get together, July 24th, 1930, and they're Transcontinental Western Air, Inc., so it's TWA. He owns TWA the rest of his life. 1950 becomes Trans World Airlines officially, but that wasn't the original acronym. It wasn't the original reason for the acronym TWA. Another big moment here. TWA had some older equipment. They got from Western Express, the Knut Rockne crash, 1931. They need new airplanes. They go to Boeing and say, you have this brand new airplane. We're the first modern airliner, the Boeing 247. Can we get one? Actually, can we get a fleet of 5 to 10? I said, sorry, United Airlines has all the slots. You can't get any of these. So Jack Fry, who was the VP of operations, he gets Lindbergh and some others together and says, okay, we need to have somebody who builds a plane that can compete with United's 247. In this office right here, so downtown Kansas City Airport, they're at 10 Richards Road. In that office upstairs, Jack Fry sat at his desk and wrote out this letter with Lindbergh's help, saying, this is what I want. I want a tri-motor, I want to fly this fast, I want it to land at this speed. And oh, by the way, you have to be able to take off from our highest airport, which is Winslow, the TWA route, on 1 engine. Well, actually, with 1 engine dead. So they said a tri-motor, you have 2 motors. Well, who responded but it was Donald Douglas. Douglas was a military contractor, didn't have much experience besides the airmail, the M2, and they wanted to build an airplane for TWA. And the traditional history is it was a done deal. That it was right off, oh yes, Douglas is our company, we love this, we built the first DC-1 by mid-1933, became the DC-2, which is a world-changing airplane, became the DC-3, so the foreground here is the DC-3, the Lindbergh line, like that on the side of the airplane. This is at New York, and it was like, yes, this is the plane we're going to have, and it will change the world, which it did. But in the archives, Al and I were looking, this is something that I found interesting. It wasn't obvious to the executives at TWA that Douglas was going to be the winner. They actually put money on 2 companies and 2 designs. This is the General Aviation Manufacturing GA-38, an airplane that, as far as I know, never even was built as a prototype. Somebody knows that differently, please let me know. But it was backed by General Motors. General Motors had a pretty big stake in TWA at the time, so there may have been the politics there with investors. But TWA put money down, $125 grand on each proposed design, and even as late as November 1933, they're still hopeful that this airplane is going to come through for TWA, and then it doesn't, and General Aviation says, no, we're not going to give you an airplane, give you money back, we're out. But that was something that I had found very interesting with aviation history, that this was actually a real potential competitor for TWA's adopting the DC-1 and DC-2. Well, Limburg becomes quite controversial by the late 1930s. He has been hounded mercilessly by the media, the Limburg baby kidnapping, and a whole media circus. And he decides he wants to leave the country, goes to England, and then he often visits Germany, already on behalf of the US military to check out the Air Force. He goes to an event in Berlin, and it's in October 1938, and Hermann Goering presents him with a medal. This is housed here at the museum. It's my picture of it when it was on display here at the museum. And it was on as a commemorating his flight in 1927. And he thought, oh, thank you, that's great. And he puts it away and doesn't think much of it. His wife says, wait a minute, this is highly unpopular. This is the Nazis are not, you don't want to associate with them. She called it albatross and said, this is not good for you to accept this medal. And he still shrugs it off. And it became really something that he never did recover from. He began being quite anti-Semitic, made a lot of statements that people was like, no, we don't really agree with him. And quietly, December 1938, TWA drops the Limburg line from advertising. It just quietly goes away. And they're making little announcements of it. And they call themselves the transcontinental line at that point. But that was the exit of Limburg from TWA. He would die in the mid-1974. He would pass away, but had no association with the airline. Enter Howard Hughes. So Howard Hughes, you probably have heard before, very wealthy. His father invented a drill bit for the oil industry, patented it, made lots and lots of money, and then died at an early age. And his wife, Howard's mom, died early, and Howard was a teenager with all kinds of money. He was awash in cash, and what to do. Decides airplanes and movies, two exciting things, 1920s, and makes the movie Hell's Angels. He makes all this money into movies, and then with airplanes. He flies around the world in a Lockheed aircraft. He becomes so famous, and he has all this money. Well, TWA had a problem. They needed new airplanes. And the Boeing 307 Stratoliner was a Boeing-produced, first pressurized airliner of its time, four-engined, to go across the United States. And Jack Fry wanted to purchase these. The Lehman Brothers and those that had the company, TWA, balked at it. And Fry did an end run around, went to Howard Hughes himself and said, Howard, you're an aviator, I'm an aviator, how about help me out here? And would you want to invest in TWA and help us fund buying these new airplanes we desperately need? And Howard said, sure, sounds like a good idea, and he does so. Well, let's go real fast. Well, as Howard Hughes is coming on board, the new slogan is an airline run by flyers. And Jack Fry, as I mentioned, he had been an early pioneer, very active in the airline industry and pioneering new technologies. And Paul Richter's right-hand man, also being TWA executive position, and then Howard Hughes. So airline-led research, Willie Post helped flight of 40,000 feet or so in the 1930s. Pretty amazing. Been to the jet stream, doing some really cutting-edge research. And so it was true about airline run by flyers. There's some symmetry of the end of the airline in 2001 to have Compton be head of the airline and be a line pilot, actually be a flyer as well. Well, the 307 is one thing, but Fry and Hughes had better and bigger grand plans, and they wanted to develop an airliner that would fly coast to coast, nonstop, do it twice as fast as other airliners, and they would envision the Constellation, the Lockheed Connie. World War II intervenes, and the U.S. Army says, thank you very much, we will take those and put them into service. But this is a pretty interesting picture. Alan found this one. This is quite fascinating. See Howard Hughes circled there. This is in April 1944. This is the delivery of the first, it's called a C-69 Constellation. for the military, but see the colors on it? TWA. Is not U.S. Army olive drab. And Hap Arnold and company didn't like this, but Howard Hughes made sure that TWA had the rights for the training and for testing, and he used that to put the airline logo on it and use advertising. So Fry and Hughes flew coast to coast in record time. It's a speed record, LA to Washington, D.C. After they arrived, he gets together a bunch of senators and hey, you want to take a ride? Let's go check out the sites. And here's the group. As you can see, Harry Truman there, just to the right of Howard Hughes. Other person I circled is Senator Owen Brewster, who had become a great nemesis of Howard Hughes. Brewster thought that Hughes and his projects, like would become the Spruce Goose, were taking a lot of flick money and not giving any value back to the taxpayer. And so they had these hearings in Congress, and that Howard Hughes actually had a better Brewster. Brewster actually left Congress over it all, lost his seat from state of Maine, and was quite discredited out of this. And Howard Hughes came out the better for it, quite interestingly. But the Constellation, that would be a truly aircraft that changed the world with its speed and its range, particularly the post-war era. Speaking of post-war, the international routes, so TWA during the war would fly over 9,000 transoceanic flights and would carry the president numerous occasions. A lot of experience with flying and overseas, and then in the later 40s authorized to go to Europe, Middle East, India, and beyond. There was issues with safety of crews as they got over to China, and they'd actually reached that at that point. Of course, if you know your aviation history, Pan Am was the chosen instrument in international air travel for the United States, and this rivalry developed between Juan Trippe of Pan Am and Howard Hughes of TWA. The official name change in 1950 to Trans World Airlines, really signaling their ambition. 1947, Hughes decides he wants to be in charge. He never actually had actual title. There's always his proxies, others who would have the position on the boards. He ousted Fry, got rid of Richter, and ownership stake up to 73% by the late 1940s. And for the next 12 years, it's 1960, he would truly be in charge of TWA. Interestingly, the aircraft TWA would buy weren't owned by TWA. It was Hughes Tool Company bought the airplane. So if you're the president of TWA and you say, I'd like to have this airplane do such and such, Howard Hughes could say, no, I'm going to use that for my personal use, or I have a friend to Hollywood who needs to have a flight, bring it on over. And there were cases of flights where they're ready to board the passengers, and suddenly a call from Howard Hughes says, put the people up for the night at the hotel, airplane's coming to take some Hollywood starlet on a flight. And the airline had to stand down and say, okay, it's your airplane, you're in charge. So yeah, the corporate officials that had to work with Howard, and he became quite erratic after his crash, the XF-11 in the late 1940s. And by 1947, 48, he disappeared from the public and began to live in his own world, and exhibited lots of very strange behaviors. And there's lots of books written about Howard Hughes and what he descended into. But that just crashed, that he had a lot of painkillers, so morphine and the like, and became addicted. And that was a large part of his demise. And finally died in the mid-1970s. So what happened to Howard Hughes with the end of his time at TWA? It was jets. The airline needed jets. This is the mid-1950s. United, Pan Am, American Airlines, they line up for Boeing 707, and the company leadership at TWA says, Howard, we need to place an order. And he's like, oh, maybe not. Maybe we should build our own airplane. Call it Project Greenland in Florida. And we don't know if it's actually for real or if it's just his imagination. But he waited a long time to finally place an order. Also ordered the Condor 880. Placed an order for over 60 airplanes, but it's $400 million, the price tag. And Hughes is used to having all this money to pay cash for his airplanes. He didn't have that kind of cash. And the airline said, we need to borrow money to buy airplanes. And Howard says, no, we're not going to do that. They eventually did have this fight that took place between Howard Hughes as he was running out of cash to buy the jets. And a voting trust then stepped in and took over for him in 1960 and effectively pushed him out from his position of dictating the airline. However, that last line of there, the lawsuits just kept going between TWA and Howard Hughes and then Howard Hughes' estate. 1987, they were finally settled. So 27 years of litigation weighed on the company. And while we all look at Carl Icahn and go, whoa, what did this guy do to the company? It was Howard Hughes that dragging down the company even prior that did a lot of damage to the airline. Other side notes, the flight center in JFK Airport in New York, the Aeroceremon designed was to exhibit and exemplify the great spirit of flight and the glamour of flying. And it's, of course, today turned into a hotel and a really fine facility. Also, TWA and Disneyland. Of course, Disney came from Kansas City. TWA had a lot of connections with Kansas City. And in the 1950s, the airlines struck a 5-year contract to be the exclusive way to go to Disneyland. And the rocket to the moon ride in Disneyland had the TWA logo, the official airline of Disneyland. So there was a lot of connections there between Disney and TWA. Well, TWA did pretty well during the 1960s overall. 1967, Baron Hilton approaches TWA and says, "I'd like to buy your company." And they go, "No, we're a lot larger than your company." It was the International Hilton International, technically. So it had these 42 hotels, 28 countries. But got the idea started and decided there was synergy between the hotels and the airline. So people fly the airline, get the hotel, the same package deal. And also, hotel business is much more stable, not cyclical like the airline industry. And so they merged together in 1967, and it seemed to work pretty well. If the airline was down, hotels were up. It helped there. They added Canteen Corporation in 1973 and in 1978, created Trans World Corporation as a holding company. And TWA, the airline, is now just another subsidiary of Trans World Corporation. As one of the presidents said, we were a holding company, happy to have an airline. We're no longer focused on the airline. 1978, deregulation happens. Fierce competition between the airlines, and TWA decides that they need to probably not remove themselves entirely, but largely from Chicago here and focus on St. Louis. And of course, St. Louis-Lambert became TWA's busiest airport. Also, as far as food service, Century 21 real estate. So the airline was just one of many businesses now of this company. But I realized he just make it independent. 1984 spun off. And it was Alan came up with a wording here that was cast adrift on troubled waters, and the sharks were waiting, is the line that I pulled from our book. So, one of those sharks, Carl Icahn, Frank Lorenzo, two names that there's not much love lost in this room for Freedom One. So both that competed for TWA in 1985, and as we did research here, it's really the unions hated Lorenzo more than they feared Icahn, was our assessment of that why would you pick Icahn. His business model, selling assets, cutting fares, slashing costs, and squeezing unions for concessions was, he had a history of this. He's only about 50 years old when he takes over TWA. Other cases of Hammermill Paper, the Tappan Appliance Company, he had raided many of the companies and had a pretty big history of this, but TWA was the largest of the targets that he went for. Ozark Airlines, and many audience tonight that flew for Ozark and were employed at Ozark Airlines. St. Louis's hometown airline, Lambert's with Alan's book up there with the biggest airline that did very, very well. Started as one of those local service airlines, 1950s, grew and grew and succeeded wildly and had a nice fleet of DC-9s. 1992, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and then Icahn resigned as officer, director of the airline in January of 93. And you note here in 7 years, had more than $1 billion in debt, sold hundreds of millions of assets, pocketed its own hundreds of millions, and in the day failed to order a single new airplane in the years that he was part of leading the airline. Made promises, but never actually happened. Well, as our research indicate, it was employees of the company that really pulled it through, that made the concessions, that made the airline what it was, and to drive it forward. And this picture, I think, exemplifies that. The Wings of Pride aircraft, as a new MD-80, and that the employees committed to making that payment of over $200,000 per month to have this flying for the airline. The Caribou Ticket Program, something that would drag down the airline, and heard of that before. It was prepackaged bankruptcy in 1995. Icon had loaned about $190 million to TWA and was demanding that back, a balloon payment in early '95. Put them back into bankruptcy, but he said, I'll delay that, but you have to agree to this Caribou Ticket Program. And a bad deal all the way around that really denied TWA the right to its own tickets and its own pricing and pricing power, and would cripple the airline greatly. And just as the airline started to get back on its feet, Flight 800 would occur in July 1996, and everyone aboard would perish. An airplane flight leaving New York, JFK, and went over to Long Island, and would explode in mid-flight, and the pieces come down into the ocean. It was a truly tragic, an awful event for the airline and for air travel in general, and something that would truly traumatize the company and the people that are part of the company. So Jerry Gittner would assume the helm as last chairman of TWA, and took the helm in the wake of Flight 800, and would try to lead the airline in its fight for survival. And Alan and I are privileged to get to talk to him. Interesting individual, and he had a lot of experience in airlines, working with Frank Lorenzo, actually TWA back even earlier than that, helped found People's Express, had a lot of experience with airlines, and applied that in TWA. Then Bill Compton, climbed the last aviator, as I mentioned, he was an active pilot at TWA, started in 1968, president CEO in early 2000. And he knew the clock was ticking. There was a big payment due in January of 2001. And he went around to all the airlines saying, would you please buy us? I don't want to see this airline dismembered. Happened to Braniff, happened to Pan American, happened to Eastern. I want to keep this together, keep the employees, keep the airplanes. Let's not just make pieces out of this. And he accomplished that with American Airlines. To have a sale to one airline for all the people and the assets of TWA. The end of the line, the Lindbergh line, of course, 2001, have the merger, American Airlines. Nobody foresee the September 11th terrorist attacks on our country that changed in a moment the whole landscape of the industry in air travel. The last flight, in December 2001, Kansas City to St. Louis, Bill Compton captained that flight, and it was a sad moment, but a proud moment. 75 years of history of TWA and an outstanding company with an outstanding history.
Just to have you introduce yourself, tell us your history with TWA, and then I would like you to comment on what we're seeing tonight. I mean, I just don't know if we said we're going to tell the history of another company if we would pack the auditorium like we have here tonight. So what is it about TWA that has stuck in people's imaginations that they still want to talk about it? Maurice, why don't we start with you and then we'll come down this way. But first, introduce yourself and tell us your role at TWA.
My name is Maurice Falls. I was a flight attendant, in-flight manager, in-flight service manager. It's a difference. From 95 till 2011, basically, with the survival of the flight attendants with the merger with American by Claire McCaskill. And just been all over the world, and nothing changes your mindset. and open you up to so many ideas and as traveling around the world and meeting different people.
My name is Jerry Castellano, and I started with from Ozark Airlines with TWA as a flight attendant in 1986, and spent most of my time from 1989 until 2003 in our St. Louis Training Center, where TWA was the only airline that I know of that for safety training, we trained our pilots and flight attendants together, because in an emergency, that's how they had to work. A few other airlines tried it and it got so contentious they had to give it up. But we managed to make it work, and I think to this day it was one of the most outstanding training departments of anyone that I'd ever obviously not been associated with, but even observed.
Greg Pochapsky. I started with Ozark Airlines in 1974. Been flying captain there about the last 2 years before we were bought out or merged or whatever we did with TWA. And until 2001, I flew the line, and then later on managed the MD-80 and the 767 757 program. And then we did that for 3 more years after the American acquisition, until the LLC went away, and then I went back into the fleet line as a captain. And the whole thing was kind of a blur. 1 application, 3 airlines, and then all of a sudden it's over. So.
My name is Rhonda Hamm-Niebruegge, and I started with Ozark Airlines too, with several of you in the room here. We morphed it, and I started at LaGuardia Airport, and so came to St. Louis, which Missouri was my home. Came to St. Louis when the merger happened in 1986. Worked on the ramp for a long time, ran passenger services for TWA, ultimately ran the hub when we had a large hub, morphed to run the eastern region for TWA, and then had the pleasure of running North American airports for TWA, so probably one of the greatest opportunities of my lifetime. Merged with American in 2001, didn't want to move to Texas, opted to stay in St. Louis and go back to running the hub, and over the next 6 years, had the unfortunate job of taking it apart. So when that was finished in 2009, I had been asked to come over and run the airport. And I have been at the airport since December 2nd of 2010. And while we're not back to the hub days that we were, we've been able to grow it back and find new partners and try to recreate what we had, I think, at some time for this region and for this community. And I think, Jody asked why we see all these people in the room, and I think it's because not only the love of aviation, and so many of you here were part of it, whether you were with Ozark, TWA, American, or all 3 of it, but as a region and as a community, I think it's part of our history that is so important and so passionate, and the ups and downs of it are what make it fascinating, and people just never forget.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Ozark. So you all worked for Ozark. What made Ozark so special? And then take me through the merger. When you found out what the feeling of the teams were. Who wants to talk about Ozark first?
I feel like I'm in a lineup. It's hard for me to be objective about this, but I've had this conversation with many people, would probably stretch over days. I've never experienced or even observed a company that had the camaraderie and essentially felt like a family as Ozark Airlines. Really, to this day, we existed for 36 years, we've been gone for 37 years, we still have annual reunions. It was a very informal place to work. Everyone kind of, once you were in there, it's like they know that you're doing your job. We had extraordinary service. I mean, we would serve food between St. Louis and Chicago. We'd serve our wine cellar flight, on an hour and 35 minutes to Dallas Fort Worth. It was entirely, that's almost like science fiction these days. But basically, everyone respected everyone else's job. We had Salvador Cristofoli was our director of cabin services. A main reason, one of the reasons why we were very successful. As a flight attendant, you had his phone number in the manual. If something wasn't done right somewhere, he wanted to know about it right away. There was no hierarchy or anything. And as I said, it was very informal. And of course, I think the first difference that most of us noticed in transition to TWA is that it was much more formal. And there were a lot more rules. And of course, there's a reason for that, because when you have a small group of people, like a family, you work around everyone else's quirks. And we had a lot of quirky people at Ozark. I often say that if they had psychological testing, a lot of us would not have been hired. You can understand why it was a different environment, and it worked out better for some groups or specific employees than it did for others. So there are still a lot of people that essentially their airline career ended in 1986 when Ozark was purchased.
Yeah, the thing about Ozark Airlines, from our experience on the pilot side, was that they had a deep, deep background and experience. Most of the guys that we started flying with in the 70s had flown in World War II in one theater or the other. And a lot of us came out of the military. We were 25 years old. We pretty much thought we knew everything. And we started flying with these guys that flew on D-Day or flew in the islands during World War II. And you realized these guys can do this with their eyes closed. They're making 9 stops a day from DC-3s and Fairchilds. And now we're at the jet age, and they've done it all. And they were the greatest mentors that you could have had at that time. We didn't have any flight engineers. We all started out in one of the pilot seats. And you flew with a lot of personalities, as Jerry said. Sometimes you fly 2 days, and at the end you might be offered a landing. Or you'd make all the landings while somebody read a newspaper. It depended. They were great people. You virtually knew everybody. Our division was, we had a Chicago base and a St. Louis base, and we talked about just Chicago people, because you didn't know them. You'd pass them in the crew lounge, and then later on they merged the 2 bases and you got to know everybody. So it was a very, very close family, as evidenced by the reunion we have every year. And then we went on to TWA. It took a couple of years to get acclimated. It was a different philosophy, bigger airline, an international division. I think at the time they had 5 or 6 crew bases scattered around the country from the west coast to the east. So one base would talk about the other base and their particular quirks. We learned a lot. We learned a lot from the TWA people. And I really enjoyed my time at TWA. They offered us some opportunities we wouldn't have had at Ozark just because of the types of airplanes and the route structure. And then in 2001 we went to America and had to learn another culture. It was tantamount to being a junior or senior in high school and changing all the time. You knew all the stuff that mattered, but they just did it a different way. And if you learned to acclimate and just kind of adapt, you'd survive. We had some folks that didn't survive the transition.
Yeah, I think for Ozark, for me, I think the thing that stands out is there was such a respect, and that respect, I think, came from Edward Crane on down, our CEO and president. And he believed that Midwestern people had great work ethic and would make great employees. So they really focused on hiring people from the Midwest to really bring the type of customer service that he wanted to the airline. And part of that was the way you looked and the way you dressed. And I remember when working in New York and my mom and dad flying up, and you had to wear a suit and tie. Today, where's a suit and tie if you're non-revving? But back then, it was, if you were non-revving on the flight, you respected the fact that you had that as a privilege. And I think that respect morphed over as we merged and as we became part of the TWA. And I had the operational side of the house, so I was always with the ramp agents and with the customer service agents was really the realm that I worked in, not on the flight side. But I think, once it was a little rough start, I think when the people from TWA that did merge over, and most of the ramp, most of the agents did move over to TWA, but there was a nice camaraderie that formed in very short form, and I think carried through many years as TWA employees. But I think it goes back to the respect that was ingrained in you when you were hired with Ozark, that it's a job you should be proud of. We're a proud company. We're proud to have you as part of it, but there was a mutual respect that you needed to understand and respect their rules. And I think that's what made it very different, I think, from the industry we live in today.
The merge from Ozark over to TWA, I was TWA in '85. I was junior to a lot of flight attendants that came from Ozark. So that changed from, I was international out of New York. I moved back to St. Louis, and I was basically flying international out of St. Louis. We were flying to Frankfurt, Hawaii, and we could go to Chicago and fly 770 to London, and 747s. So when we merged, I became junior, and so I went from going to Heathrow, London to Des Moines in October. North Dakota, we had a flight to North Dakota. It was the coldest night of my life. We're at a Ramada Inn in North Dakota somewhere, and the whole town is frozen. And the windows on the hotel completely frozen. But the Ozark people were just so remarkable in character and personality that it was just something to remember, because it did help initiate and engrave in us the family of the Midwest, and it was remarkable. But the Ozark people, with that merge, coming from TWA side, it was an opportunity for me to speak about how that, from 24-hour layovers on an Delta 11 in San Francisco to 24-hour layovers in Des Moines in the middle of November, October. It was just remarkable. So I just wanted to say that.
One funny quick story, and I know this, a friend of mine in this room will remember this, but when you started with Ozark, the first thing you had to learn were the city codes. And, learning city codes, you had to memorize them, you had to know them by heart, so you would find ways to remember them. And so we had Sioux City, Iowa, you always remember it sucks because it was Sioux City, Iowa. Or you had Springfield, Missouri, and it was SCUF, it was FGF. So you found these acronyms that today you still remember, because that was the thing that you could not pass any class if you did not 100% know your city codes, because everything was handwritten back then.
Jerry, I know a lot of people in this audience know, but can you tell us about the Silver Swallows?
The Silver Swallows actually started as it was a pilot organization, and honestly, I think it started in sort of more or less like a burial society, if anyone knows of that. It was almost like a insurance, everyone kind of pooled their resources if something happened to someone. And it was exclusively a pilot organization, I think until around 2007 or 8. Rich Roberts was our vice president of operations at Ozark. And Rich had the very good idea of opening it up to all of the former employees and even people who are now employees or members as well. And we had probably, I would say in 2010s, that period of time, we would have reunions, 600-700 people would not be unusual. And unfortunately, we're just losing people. But our last one was close to 300 or 400 people, which is pretty amazing, because I think at our largest we had like 3,000 employees towards the end. It's a very unusual. We've said that we have a newsletter that comes out 6 times a year, and it's still amazing when people get together. Just a real quick story that kind of illustrates it for me. In 2007, I started to try to make a documentary, which ultimately we finished. They have a copy here, a little pull-out. But anyway, we got someone from KETC to come out and to our reunion. And it was a young woman in her 20s. And I could tell that she really wasn't thrilled about spending a Saturday morning with a bunch of old people. So I run into her about 2 hours after she comes out. It's just her and a camera person. And she is absolutely fascinated. And the reason was, to her, at her age, flying was like going to the DMV. And she's hearing all these stories about what our service was like. some of the escapades that happened, and the statute of limitations has long, it doesn't apply to any of these anymore, but things that happened on layovers, things that happened on charters, and to her it was a different world. And to us it was just, you know, another day at Ozark. So I think that kind of helped bond most of us together, because, you know, what happens at Ozark stayed at Ozark.
Jerry and Greg, you mentioned characters at Ozark. Do you see any of them in the crowd? You want to call out the character? Okay.
That's statute of limitations.
That's right. So when I talked to someone about this panel, the very first thing they said was, I hope you're going to talk about how horrible Carl Icahn was. So now is the point where we're going to talk about Carl Icahn, but specifically what you saw and how you experienced that chapter of TWA history. So who wants to start there? Someone has to, by the way.
Well, under Carl, things got difficult to do from a business standpoint. And at the time, or shortly thereafter he came on board, I was managing the MD-80 fleet. And we needed stuff from McDonnell Douglas out in Long Beach, and it was difficult to get done because we had zero credit, or less than zero credit. In fact, we used to say that no payment is the same as cash. In fact, I went out to pick up an airplane one time, and they had we call it a level 5 FTD, which is a flight training device, which is basically a cockpit of an MD-80 with no motion on it, and but all the switches work, so you can do intermediate training of pilot time. We found this thing out there, we cut a deal for, and I can't tell you the dollar amount now, per month, and I don't think we ever paid them. Ever. And they would call monthly. It was nice to talk, and I said, I'll check on this. I'm certain that it's just a matter of downtown office sending you a check, but I don't think we ever did pay for it. And that kind of stuff went on all the time, so it's a credit to the TWA people as a family that keep that airline going. It's just, in fact, under Carl Icahn, when we needed airplanes, we had found I think it was two MD-80s or 4 MD-80s earlier on before Carl got there, and they were rejected. They were Swissair airplanes, or Bauer airplanes, a subsidiary of Swissair, and they didn't fit our fleet. They had different compass systems and different flight guidance systems in it, and it would have been just cost prohibitive. But after Carl got done with us and we needed airplanes, we got those airplanes from Switzerland. We were tired. They had to go out to, it was Tucson, we took them, and they redid the compass systems at the cost of about $1 million for the entire cockpit, another $1 million in the back of the airplane. But we were buying used airplanes all the time. In fact, I can recall going to Frankfurt and looking at a couple of MD-80s that were really tired, and they were the only thing we could even talk about buying at that time. And that's the kind of stuff we lived with until TWA 800 went down. And this is sort of a question everybody has, is we were going around looking at used airplanes, and all of a sudden we were getting a lot of new airplanes. And I didn't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but all of a sudden I get my boss calling me, telling me I got to go out and pick up brand new MD-80s in Long Beach, about 2 a month, and we couldn't figure that out. So if anybody's got the answer, let me know. I still haven't figured it out.
Well, Rhonda, do you want to talk about Carl Icahn?
Well, I actually had dinner with him twice, so I met him. And his first word to me when I walked up was, he said, I didn't know that tall women grew up in the Midwest. Because I could look in my eye, because I always made sure I had my higher heels on. You know, he was interesting because he could be a nice person if you were just in a conversation, not talking about the airline. But, you know, things that stuck in my mind was, we had an Admiral's TWA Ambassador Club at West Palm Beach. And it was only because Carl had an uncle there, and his uncle wanted a club. And so we had a club in West Palm Beach until the day it shut down. And, you know, it didn't meet any of the criteria, but it didn't matter. It's because he wanted. So you hear, you know, some of the stories about Howard Hughes and some of the oddities that he had, it was the same way with Carl. If there was something that he wanted, he was going to have it. It didn't matter whether it fit within the portfolio of what made sense. If he wanted it, he had it. So that's the type of individual he was. I mean, nobody, he was a very intelligent man. He just had a reason to look at things different in our industry, I think, which was unfortunate.
Jerry, any Carl Icahn stories or thoughts?
Well, we were merged in after the flight attendants at TWA went on strike. And Ozark Airlines recognized, even in the day when you probably purchased your ticket from someone in person, you went to a ticket counter, you obviously interacted with the agent, as you still do, realized that you spent most of your time on the face of Ozark Airlines was going to be the flight attendants. Not saying that because that's what it was, but you spend more time with the public than anyone else. And the fact that he just figured they could just all be replaced says a lot about what his business acumen was at one level, did extremely well for himself. And of course, with the purchase of Ozark, it was something like $300 million or whatever, I don't know what it was. Ozark owned all, but I think the two of our aircraft. We owned like 50 aircraft. And within weeks, he had made the purchase price back by selling the aircraft. We had to lease them to operate them, so our operating costs went way up, but longevity of the carrier wasn't his, his main goal. And my father always had a saying about different people. He'd say, they could teach the mob how to steal. And in that case, I think Carl probably could.
So we have got one question. If there are any other questions, we have about 10 more minutes, so if you do have any questions, please send those to Emily Underwood there. For people who don't know, can you all remind us what happened with it was 1986 was the flight attendant strike, right? Remind us what happened and how TWA reacted. Who wants to take that?
Well, it was, I was flying international, so I was really away from most of it. And so it was in New York, and we were, like I said, we were in hotels in Europe. So we wouldn't really get any information back, but I now lived with flight attendants, and so they were always asking me what was going on. And I'm like, why are they asking me what's going on? Because we weren't seeing what was going on in St. Louis or in different factors. And Carl Icahn had developed this system where if you didn't come to work, that was it for you. You were fired. And we weren't on long enough to even be in the union for them to protect us under that circumstance. And so, like I said, we were in Europe most of the time. And then so all my roommates, everybody either lose their job or go back to work. And mostly everyone that I knew, they all had to come back because of life circumstances in itself. We were real young. And so without a job and stranded, it was really, it's not funny now, but he really put us under a circumstance of, either you're going to do this or that's it, You're going to find your way home from Europe, And so you could only call off sick for so long and all of those things that were relevant. And so basically that's how it just went, the strike went like that. Ozark was here, I don't remember how long it even lasted because we had a strong woman by the name of Vicki Frankovich, who was actually the president of the union at the time, and she was really not going to take this from this guy. And unfortunately, we had to get in and to keep our airline, and that's what happened basically. And one thing that I was really, we leased those planes back from Carl Icahn, right? So it was his company, so they already had the airplanes. So he put the airplanes under a different company like TWA Leasing or something relevant and charged the airline for the airplanes. This guy was just, he was just a crook, and he just robbed us blind. And it wasn't very much we could really even do about it. But we kept our airline. You know,
Rhonda?
missed it remarkably.
Yeah, Rhonda, you were going to say something about the strike.
Yeah, coming from Ozark, and we merged in '86, so it was, you know, the strike was right there. And I think the one thing that I remember most from it and was there was a lot of animosity at the time between those that crossed the line and those that didn't. And a lot of people had spouses working on the airport side as well. And that tension carried for a long time. It was a tough strike, and no matter which side you were on, it was a tough strike. And you know, I can remember, especially coming in new from the TWA side, where we were such a family and so close-knit, and you know, lifelong friendships were split just because it was such a difficult time for people. And you know, as Maurice said, some people had no choice because they had to feed their families, they had to stay working. But I just remember the animosity, and that stuck around for a long time between some people when that happened.
Well, a more pleasant question from the audience. Said, I had the fanciest flight experience of my life at age 10 flying to Europe. Could you talk about the Royal Ambassador section on the plane? She says, I'm hoping I'm remembering that name correctly.
Well, that was basically the business class, where you had choices of meals and things like that. You did get one of the little care pouches where you got footies and eye blinders and the toothbrush and all of those things. And it was a big experience. Back then they had little caps, and we would give you wings, and so it would play up real big. It was a great the services. It's so remarkable, the services that they have now. As simple as a flight from Philadelphia, you would do a cocktail service. You would run meals on a full load, run hand meals, because we didn't have the carriers at the time. So you're running these trays down the aisle after the cocktail service, come back and do a beverage service after the meals are served, and then come back and pick them up, and then do a coffee service. And that's an hour 50 minutes. That's an hour 50 minutes. And then, and what's funny is that the women flight attendants, they had to wear heels. Now you can have flats for your in-flight, but they would change them back into heels and the whole nine. It was a remarkable time as far as service was concerned, and we were proud to be flight attendants. One little funny thing about it is that we had Ralph Lauren uniforms, and that was a big deal to us. Nice Ralph Lauren double-breasted uniforms, and so we really took pride in our appearance. As a matter of fact, we were always checked. They would come and check on you. We had supervisors that would meet a flight every now and then to see if you were according to standards at the time. So if you didn't have your uniform, if you were doing certain things and it wasn't appropriate, then you would get tagged and you would have to meet your supervisor. And you only got so many times to make these mistakes. So.
Of course, the passengers also dress better than us. So.
It is. I see kids getting on airplanes.
I didn't mean to get you started, Maurice.
They're on airplanes with pajamas and house shoes. I just never really.
I once got the chance to interview Betty Manlin, who was in the very first class of TWA air hostesses. So I believe, Daniel, that's 1935. And she told a story of one time flying and birds hitting the windshield and breaking the windshield. They went to the back, got all the women's fur coats, stuffed it in the windshield, and kept going. So, amazing story. So, another question was, did anyone ever consider going to Southwest when things started going bad at TWA?
There were people that left, especially when UPS started. We had at least 2 people in my class that left and went to UPS. They were direct entry captains because they were just starting their fleet. So they went from MD-80 DC-9 captain over to 757 or DC-8 at the time at UPS. We had others that left, and they went to let's see, one of them went to National, which was not a good move, but he was born and raised in Miami. National was acquired by Pan American, and then Pan American dissolved, and parts of it went out to the Pacific with United, and parts of it, pieces went to Delta. So yeah, some people jumped ship. There were a few that left and went to United too at the same time. That would have been about 1986, 7, 8, in that time frame.
We had the same on the agent and ramp side, and there's still several today. We had some supervisors that also went over to Southwest here in St. Louis, and some of the ramp agents and agents are still working over there today. And then we have, I mean, if you go to the ticket counters in St. Louis, and if you've been around long enough, you can see faces at every one of the ticket counter, not everyone, but most of them, that eventually either work for Ozark and or TWA and might work for American or Delta now. So we did have a number jump ship because they wanted to stay in St. Louis and they just didn't know what the outcome might be.
So there are so many questions that we didn't get to that I had hoped to get to, but I know we're running close on time. I'm sure afterwards people would be willing to talk to you, hear some of your own stories. I did want to sort of end future looking, what your hopes are for flight, what changes you see ahead. But Rhonda, I would be remiss while we have you on stage if you didn't talk a little bit about what's on the horizon for Lambert and what you see happening there.
Thanks, Jody. So hopefully most everybody's heard that we're looking at the future and we're thinking about a consolidated terminal. And I love this terminal. I think it's one of the most fabulous monuments in this country, or even in the world, when you think about aviation and the design that Yamasaki built here in St. Louis. But the terminal doesn't fit today's needs. It's got very narrow concourses, very small gate hold, separate checkpoints. So we embarked on a master plan. We submitted that master plan last year to the FAA. It was approved this year in March. We're undertaking the environmental impacts of that now. That's a year-long process with the FAA. And we are hoping sometime next year that we will get the agreement with our airline partners to extend our current use and lease agreement with them and go out for full architectural design of the proposed terminal that we have. It is a single terminal, 62 gates. It is dual-sided. The garage in front of Terminal 1 would come down, go from 2,000 spaces to 8. The roadway system would get overhauled dramatically and give us a roadway system that's modern and can meet today's needs. I think one of them, you probably heard that we just announced about $350 million of enabling projects, and the way the terminal is going to work, if we're able to make this happen, is that it would go west first, so where the Missouri Air National Guard is, where the central utility plant is, where our airfield maintenance, all of those things are going to be torn down next year, and new ones are going to be built in locations to allow that western wing to be filled first. So that approval of 350 we've already got from the airline, so we'll be doing those enabling projects. It'll take about 2.5 years to complete all of those, but we continue then to negotiate on the longer term agreement for the new modern terminal. So I have high hopes we'll get there. It's not there yet, but it would be, I think, something that could carry this airport, much like the existing terminal did. Think about being built in 1956, and it has carried us to today. And while it's not the best, I think we've made it competitive, and people have a lot of fond memories, and it's well known throughout the world as one of the greatest terminals. So we hope that the next one can carry us that well.
Lambert, past, present, and future is a good future panel, so let's do that for Thursday night at the museum. Greg, thoughts on the future of flight, changes you see, changes you hope to see?
Well, I just wish they'd open up more seats so we could non-rev. Retired, time to go someplace, you can't get on an airplane. But I think the biggest challenge, and everybody knows about it, is where you're going to get pilots. But, it's difficult. There's a lot of discussion about changing the rules, and everybody's got an opinion on it, but it's not an entry-level job. Never has been. I don't think that the $1,500 requirement that came out as a result of a Colgan accident in Buffalo had anything to do do with 1,500 hours. They have more time than that. It's just that you've got to have people that are qualified to do it. And I think part of that is they have to have the passion for it. If you don't like being away from home, you're in the wrong business. We're in the transportation business, so it can be stressful on a family. And when we all started a few years ago, you didn't know if you were going to get furloughed. It's a job for pilots that has never been one in which you can make a lateral move. You moved up vertically in a seniority system, and if your company got in distress or shut down or went on strike, you could not get an equal job at another airline. You'd have to start at the bottom again. So it had a lot of things that people didn't like. So we gotta make it a good job for people, but we also have to have good people for the job.
Jerry?
I started just prior to deregulation in 1978, which radically changed the entire model of the airline system. You essentially, if you wanted to fly from St. Louis to Los Angeles, you could have the airplane, but you'd have to lobby for the government to give you, that would be TWA's route, and maybe they'd throw you one flight a day or something, but you had kind of a protected market. And at Ozark, if our daily average load factor was above 57 or 58%, we were going to be profitable. And as anyone old enough to know, airline tickets were a lot more expensive then. I don't think the airline business was ever designed, the terminals, the airplanes, the whatever, for a 98% load factor, which is kind of like what you have to make a profit. So I think we're still waiting to see. Southwest has done very well with their model, but airlines never seem to be. They're the most consistently profitable in the business since deregulation. But if you notice, every major carrier has gone through a bankruptcy or become part of a merger, except for Southwest, yes. And I think that someone still has to find what the answer is to make it a consistently profitable idea or business. And if I knew then, I wouldn't be here tonight.
Maurice?
I kind of want to know if any air hostesses, stewardess, or flight attendants are in the house. If you raise your hand, that's what's up, We created a standard that will never be followed again, ever, in flight. It would be nice to just get a sandwich on the airplane. If they could just give us a sandwich would be nice, They took off the peanuts, and so we can't have peanuts. We eat pretzels and cookies, and that's it. And they sit down. They serve you a cookie and a drink and sit down for hours. I can imagine that. So you guys, we were something that will never be duplicated or repeated ever again in the airline industry, and we set the standard for it. So I just want to commend you guys and thank you.